Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you all. My name is Faye. I'm a volunteer here at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, a division of the government that doesn't exist yet. And we work here to bring more queer community and to bring light to these incredible authors and the things that they're working on. So today we have with us Stephen Thrasher, Linda Villarosa, and Hugh Ryan as our moderator. So, a little bit about them. Stephen Thrasher, PhD, holds the inaugural Daniel H. Renner Chair at the Northwestern University Medill School, the first journalism professorship in the world created to focus on LGBTQ research. He is also a faculty member of Northwestern's Institute of Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Well-Being. A columnist for Scientific American, his writing has been widely published by the New York Times, Nation, The Atlantic, Journal of American History, BuzzFeed News, Esquire, and New York Magazine. In 2019, Out Magazine named him one of the 100 most influential and impactful people of the year, and the Ford Foundation awarded him a grant for creativity and free expression. An alumnus of media jobs with Saturday Night Live, the HBO film The Laramie Project, and the NPR StoryCorps Project, Dr. Thrasher has also been a staff writer for The Village Voice and a columnist for The Guardian. He holds a PhD in American Studies and divides his time between Chicago and New York. The Viral Underclass is his first book. Now, Linda Villarosa is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, where she covers the intersection of race, inequality, and health. She is a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And Hugh Ryan, our moderator, is a writer, historian, and curator. His recent book, The Woman's House of Detention, was named one of the best books of the year by Vulture and New York Magazine. His first book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, won a 2020 New York City Book Award, was a New York Times Editor's Choice, and was a finalist for the Randy Shilts and Lambda Literary Awards. He was honored with the 2020 Alan Berube Prize from the American Historical Association, is a nonfiction faculty member at the Bennington Writing Seminars, and sits on the board of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive. So as you can see, some incredible people here today. So I will leave it to them. Enjoy the event, and remember that masks are required at all times. I will be passing around a donation bag. There is a suggested donation of $10, but give what you can. And thank you guys so much for coming.
Oh my gosh. It is such an honor to be here tonight. When Stephen originally asked me to do this, I said, I am happy to, but also I feel like the most junior person on this panel, and you could get someone who's famous. But it is an honor, truly. Both of their books, if you have not read them yet, are incredible, searing, important. They are both relevant to this moment in a way that feels like they were crafted in a lab somewhere to be published right now, but also built off of decades of thinking, writing, activism. They're incredible. We're not going to be able to get into most of what is in these books tonight. We're going to talk around the books. We're going to talk about some parts of it, but you really should pick them, read them, love them as much as I have, and then check out both their works. I first became acquainted with Linda's work through the New York Times, and Stephen's, I think, was The Guardian, although maybe it was Seeing You Speak. There is a ton of their writing out there, and it is worth digging into the archive because there is so much richness to be developed from it that leads into the books that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, mostly going to step back and let them talk. We're going to have some room for y'all to talk. Before we jump in, is there anything either of you would like to say?
Thank you. Thank you to the center for hosting us. I feel really honored to be on stage with both of you. Hugh, your books are beautiful as well. And of course, I was thinking of The Women's House of Detention because it used to be just right around the corner, walking over here. Linda has been a mentor and someone I've admired from afar, and I feel really blessed that Sarah Schulman introduced us, that you helped me with my dissertation work and have just been such a role model for my professional life. And so I just feel really, really honored to be here with you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out. I'm super excited to be with both of these human beings who are wonderful and brilliant. I had the rookie mistake of getting lost on the way here because I haven't been here in a while, though I had my 30th birthday here, not on one of these floors.
9 years ago.
Last
Yeah, exactly. This year. And it sounded like that party upstairs, if you heard that. Anyway, I'm super excited to be here and I love talking about these issues.
Awesome. Well, since the two of you know each other so well, and since we have both of you on stage today, I thought we would start by doing a little something different. At a lot of these events, we ask the author to talk about their book. And in this moment, I'd actually like each of you to introduce the other person's book and say a little bit about how it connects to your work, sort of why we're in this moment here together.
You go first.
So, Under the Skin is that has built on work that Linda's been doing for many years, and I became aware of the work, I think initially through Sarah Schulman and through reading you in the New York Times. And I think what's really beautiful about this book is Hugh was saying that it's weaving together work that Linda's been doing for so long. I think that it really speaks to the ways that you have been a witness since AIDS was called GRID. I think it speaks to a really ethical core of how you understand health, something that is embodied, that is not distant, but that involves people that you both care about, that you knew before your work, but also that you've grown to care about in your work. And like you were saying, it could not have landed at a better time to have had all this work that you've been doing for so long. And I reference, some of your reporting and the themes in my own book through writing about Black gay men and the ways that you, more than almost any other writer, I think, were responsible for helping the United States writ large understand the ongoing crisis of AIDS and how it continues to unfold in our society. I think that you've been doing it for so long, and this book really shows kind of the evolution of the way that you've been working on these issues for such a long time, and you are showing how it pertains to our community, but also how it broadly is happening throughout the United States. And you bring in so many people with such generosity and warmth through the stories that you're telling. And I feel like, your story came out, the first story came out in 2017? Not the first story, but
I think so.
1 and 2 Black gay men.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah, 2017. Prior to that, I felt like it was such a small number of people in the United States who knew about these issues, and that greatly expanded it. And that was so important for opening up a framework that people could be able to perceive what was happening with COVID, and that you really helped kind of open the consciousness and take things I'm sure many people in this room have worked on around AIDS activism and around ACT UP, and really helped the country understand it a lot more. And then as consciousness was raised about systemic racism beyond Black people who knew these issues, I think that your work really helped prime the consciousness of the country, and this book really helps the country at large understand how health disparities play out and the real human way that it happens.
Thank you. I think you were one of the first people to introduce me to, in depth, the idea of HIV criminalization. So I hadn't covered that part of it, and I was really interested in your work because it took what I was thinking about and what I was reporting on to the next level. I love your voice in your book and in your work, and you are that rare person who is an academic plus a really dig deep, big heart reporter. And it really showed, especially, your pieces in The Guardian. And the Viral Underclass is perfect for right now, as you were one of those people. There was a small group of people worrying in like February and March 2020. We know what is going to happen here. We know what's going to happen with COVID because we saw what happened with HIV/AIDS. It is going to hit Black people harder. It is going to be a problem of discrimination. It's going to sink into places where there's marginalization, and you knew that. And so, for me, my book came out at the exact right time because I was so late and slow. But
So I'm going to take issue with that. if I can, because I was thinking of this, our colleague, I don't know if either of you have had the chance to meet him, Ed Yong, who's been doing such amazing reporting on COVID. He announced today he's taking a 6-month sabbatical, and he wrote this Twitter thread about why he's doing so and the toll that it's taken. And it actually made me think about I think yours was the first cover story, or the first cover story in the magazine about, certainly about race and COVID, when we were writing about the Zulu Club. And you put so much heart to that. And that was done very quickly.
It was.
Yeah. So I don't hear that you were slow. I mean, you were deep in this very quickly, and helping people understand just the slaughter that was happening in Black America very quickly.
Well, I think that I appreciate, thank you, but also, thank you for your work, because it really is important. It's important right now. You are the go-to person for many of these issues, which is super exciting to me every time I see you on media, and you're so good at that. So thank you, and thank you for this book. I really appreciate it, and so do so many others.
Yeah. I really think that's one of the hallmarks of genius, is that you have both been working on things that are urgent, important, but have not been recognized. The world has had to catch up to the work that the two of you have been doing. It's unfortunate that what's got us there is a series of overlapping global pandemics that are killing many people. But we are all, I think, a little bit richer for having your books to sort of lead us through this. So you've had a chance to talk about each other's work. Now I'd like to hear about a little bit of that richness. What is the underpinning that brought you to the place of publishing this book? How did you get here? What is the things that you have been thinking about that brought you to the moment of this publication?
For me, it was, I've been doing this for a really long time, since the 80s. And what I've noticed is that even though America is now the second wealthiest country in the world, has the most expensive healthcare system, spends more on health, medical care than any other country, with $12,000 per person per year, we still have such poor health outcomes as a country compared to other countries in the world. It starts with infant mortality. It ends with life expectancy. And so we're worse than all of these other wealthy countries, even though we're almost the richest. But always it's been that that not looking at the health of the nation, but looking at the health of people of color, and especially Black people, there's never been a time in this country where we had equal health outcomes. And then when you looked at that, there were only 2 reasons for this. One, blame, something Black people are doing wrong. 3 reasons. One, something Black people are doing wrong, something wrong with Black people's bodies, genetically different, or poverty. All Black people are poor. And so that is what is bringing this down. So I started looking at this, and it really hit me in 2017 when I was looking at maternal mortality. And the statistic that shot out at me was, we are the only country where the women and birthing people and pregnant people are dying is going up. So we're the only wealthy country where that's happened. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die or almost die than white women. And a Black woman with a master's degree, PhD, JD, or MD is more likely to almost die or lose her baby than a white woman with an 8th grade education. So now it's sort of like, well, how can all these people be doing something wrong, these highly educated people who have access to healthcare? If we know it's not genetic, what is going on here? And I first started saying there's something about race that is making these poor health outcomes. And now I say it's racism that is causing much of these racial health disparities.
For me, I was thinking about, since we're here in the Manhattan's LGBT Center, when I was working at the Village Voice, I went on a background interview with the then director of the Bronx LGBT Center, just sort of as a courtesy to see what was going on. And he talked about how they had kiki balls that they would hold, and they would charge $5 or $10, but you could get in for free if you did an HIV test. And then the thing that made me kind of go down a rabbit hole I've been in for more than a decade now was when he said, we've also found some of the young people who do become positive, we also find out that they are selling the drugs on the street for money, for various things. And at the time, I'd mostly been reporting about gay rights through marriage and through mostly through legislative and political things happening around marriage in the military. And then I started realizing AIDS was actually a much better lens to understand many of the issues that I cared about, and intersected a great deal with racism, with homelessness, with incarceration. And from that time forward, I started really taking note that sources who I worked with on matters around AIDS were incredibly helpful and kind and generous on any of these issues that I was talking about. If I was going to another city and doing something about homelessness, I could talk to the people in the AIDS network who would tell me like what was really going on. And then it was through that my editor at BuzzFeed, Mark Schoofs, reached out to me. Actually, I had never written for him yet, but he reached out to me and sent me to report on the story of Michael Johnson in St. Louis, this young man who'd been arrested for HIV transmission and was facing life in prison. And the kind of a couple of the sort of aha moments I've had in this process was when I reported on that case. I went to the jail. I met this young man. I saw how all the odds were against him. Many of the things that you were bringing up, these predeterminative health already played out. He was largely illiterate. You could see that there were multiple health things going on with him before he'd ended up in this jail. And then when I was sent back a few months later to write about Michael Brown, when I was reporting on The Guardian, I asked the same AIDS service providers that I worked with what to look for in Ferguson, and they'd said, they'd just been in the Canfield Green apartment complex because there'd been some new transmissions of HIV, and Ferguson had this higher rate of HIV and AIDS. And so I started seeing that wherever you, even at the level of cartography, looked at maps of concentrations of Black poverty, you would find infant mortality rates and higher cancer rates, higher HIV rates, and higher AIDS rates. And the virus itself could be this guide to understanding where there's sometimes, you've written about a lot in your work, a lot of social support around it when people are able to get to it. But that social support comes after all these other things have happened to get to that point, and before all these other things need to happen. And so I started seeing that the virus was a way to understand all these other problems in society. And then when COVID's cases started happening in New York, when Queens and Corona and Jackson Heights, Elmhurst were the epicenter of the epicenter, it was the same maps where you were also seeing lots of HIV cases. Same thing in St. Louis, where I did a lot of research. Same thing in Chicago. So I came to it by understanding the virus as a guide to see where things were going wrong, and also as an opportunity to build on work others had done before to try to make a better world in response to viruses.
Wow. So we're seeing the big picture, right? This is the 10,000-foot view of what these stories are about, what these books are about, what these histories and present moments are about. I'm curious about the much more close-up view. Let's talk about one individual, because this is one of the things that when you read these books, if you have not already, and you should read these books, you will find that there is so much heart to them because they center in people that you knew, people that you met, people that you interviewed, that you heard about. And those are the stories that have really stuck with me and I think stick with all of us. So is there one person or a group of people that you encountered in your work whose story you would like to tell us, to kind of give us a little bit of a close-up view of what your books are about?
My people are Simone Landrum and the Birthmark Doula Collective. I met the Latona Giwa, who was a doula in New Orleans, here in New York at a conference. And she said, why don't you come to New Orleans and see my work? Because I was trying to figure out how I could write about maternal mortality without being completely depressed. So I was like, oh, doulas, they're so great. And New Orleans, the food is so good. So I ended up in New Orleans, and I met her client, Simone Landrum. She had two young children, and then she had a baby the year before who died. And she was treated so badly by her physician, who basically blamed her for not feeling well, missed every obvious sign of preeclampsia, like from the swollen face to the headache, swollen hands. And he just dismissed everything that she said. She thought her water was breaking and she was actually bleeding out. She almost died, and she lost the baby, who she named Harmony, stillborn. So then I meet her the next year. She's pregnant, and this time she's at a different hospital, new doctor who's a woman. She's working with this doula. So I interviewed her, and she told me that story that I shared with you. And then I thought I was done. I'm like, okay, I've got this now. This is my story about maternal mortality. I've done done 30 interviews with experts, and now I have this one character who's great. All she has to do is have her baby, and then I'll write about with a happy ending. So then as I was leaving, she looked at me, and I had a feeling that she was trying to tell me something. And I said, who's going to be with you when you have the baby? And she said, the doula. And then she was looking at me. And then I thought, oh, she wants me to come back. Because I've had 2 children. I've been at the birth of all my godchildren. I told her that. And so I ended up, the baby was due December 20th. So I was at a party here in New York. I was lit, okay? It was like a Saturday night. I was having a great time. And the doula, who has, she's very serious. You need to come now. Simone is going into labor early. You need to get on a plane. So I'm like, oh my God. So I sober up and get to the airport early in the morning on Sunday. The doors close and I get a text, false alarm. She was having false labor. So I was like, oh no. So I ended up going to New Orleans, and I was trying to figure out, should I just go back home and wait? Because I was like, I don't know, 2.5, 3 weeks early. And I said, I'll just get an Airbnb. I'll work from here, and then I'll be near Simone. So now I get to know her really well because the Airbnb is like 3 blocks from her. So I cook. She just told me, she goes, can you make that chili for me again? I was cooking for them, helping her with the kids. I took her to the doctor's appointments because I had a car. We found all her old medical records from the other birth. Wow. So then it's the Monday, and the baby's due like Thursday or Friday. And we go to the appointment, and clearly something's wrong. And everything was all over the place on the screen. The lights were flashing. And the woman turns to her and says, we need to go up to labor and delivery. You need to have the baby now. So Latona, the nice, calm, experienced doula, isn't there, only hysterical me. So we go upstairs, Latona comes, and during the next like 5 or 6 hours when she was in labor, I saw her be treated so badly. And, if this was a question of poverty only, Latona is a labor and delivery nurse. I am a New York Times writer. They did not care. They treated her really badly in front of us. They were asking her questions like, oh, how many kids do you have? That's a lot of kids. Where are you going to keep this baby? When she was frightened, ill, and she had a traumatic birth before. They accused her. Her epidural wasn't right. So they said, stop complaining. And it actually wasn't the right epidural. Then the doctor came in because she was in full-blown labor. Only Latona was really holding her hand and staring. Even I was staring at the blinking lights and seeing what was happening with the baby's heart rate. Then the doctor comes in, and Latona texts me, and she's like, who is that? I was like, I don't know. This is not her doctor. It was like a much older man. And he just put on a pair of gloves and shoved his hands right inside of her. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe, after all she's been through, it's frightening here. Why is he doing this? And it was just like, I realized later, nobody had any idea that they were doing anything wrong. So then he gets some blood on his gown or whatever, and he leaves, and the younger medical students, interns, residents took turns, and they were like, she was really in a lot of pain, and she was really scared. They were going, hey, you have the baby, you catch the baby, it's your turn to deliver the baby. I was like, these people don't care about her. There was nobody of color at all. The only Black people were the 3 of us. So she had the baby, everything was fine, but I went home, back to my Airbnb. I wrote everything down, and then I went back to be with her. But I was like, I called my editor and I said, the story's changed. The center of this story has got to be what just happened, because I was not expecting to see that kind of unkind treatment and real inequality play out in front of me.
Wow.
But the baby's like 5 now. He's in kindergarten, so he's fine.
So still a happy ending to
Yes,
that
happy
part of
ending,
the story, at
yes.
least. Yeah.
Well, the Boston Globe review of my book said it's not a spoiler to say most of the stories in this book end badly. They're not as happy, but I want to, I was trying to think. The main story I write about is about Michael Johnson, but I've talked about him a lot publicly. And so I think I want to talk about and I end up writing about a number of people who passed, some who I didn't know at all, some who were quite close to people I knew. But I think I want to talk about my editor, Ward Harkavy, and I've been thinking a lot throughout the writing of the book, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts of kind of the differences of working with editors in a magazine way, working with your book editors, But Ward was one of those editors who really changed my life. And I started at the Village Voice in 2009. He was a very crusty, lifelong single, straight but kind of queer, and I think he had he'd gone to ACT UP meetings. Man, who was like a very, very crusty old school editor, and he gave me a very hard time with my first stories, pushed me in very hard ways. But my first cover story for The Voice was an offbeat tale about the pet death business. I wrote a story. I had to help my landlady bury her cat in the backyard of our brownstone. And I wondered, like, where do pets go for people who don't have backyards in New York? And found out there's this entire Tory business. They come and pick up your pet, and the city will also tell you can just leave them in a trash bag in the corner, which of course I don't think is a very nice thing to do. But I ended up interviewing all these people who are in this world. And I also found a funeral home that did not have enough people dying, and so they converted to pets. And I remember Ward helping me picking the pull quote of the person the funeral home director, who said to me, "Yeah, it's terrible. Remember the AIDS virus? I thought that was going to wipe out everybody, and then they found a cure for that, and now we don't have enough people."
Oh my God.
And so Ward helped me understand. He had this phrase. He'd always say this very Western twang: "Can't make this shit up, Thrasher." And he was also one of the people that really pushed me, even though he was a straight man. Actually, he didn't use the word homonormativity, but he was using that concept, saying go deeper than just marriage and the things that you're writing about, and pushed me to also. He was a Jewish man who was also very critical of Israel. He's the editor who edited when I was covering issues around Israel and Palestine here in the center, and he would post every day on social media. And in March 2020, he just stopped posting one day, and none of us could figure out why. He didn't have family in the area. Because we were all investigative reporters, somebody found out that he was in ICU in a hospital in Long Island, but he did not have COVID at the time. He'd had an infection from a tooth infection that led him to the ICU. And it was really, really horrible because none of us could go see him. This was, if you remember being in the city at the time, for those of you who were, you couldn't go into hospitals. We're trying to also arrange, when he gets out, can one of us go stay with them? But then, of course, you think you're going to kill him. And they were saying at the time, you can't get near anyone elderly or anyone who's been sick in any way. And then we were trying to, with his family far away, figure out, could we crowdsource and hire a nurse? But of course, you could not hire nurses at the time. But then we got word that he was stabilizing, he was okay. And then they sent him to a nursing home to recover because we couldn't figure out a way to get him home. And the Cuomo administration at the time was sending people with COVID to recover in nursing homes, and that's where he got COVID, and that's where he died. And so it was this real absurdity that he'd gone from a tooth infection to dying of COVID in just the matter of about 2 weeks. And it was a kind of absurdity that I think he would have felt particularly ironic and angry about because he hated Donald Trump. He also hated Andrew Cuomo, and they both played a role in his death. And I thought a lot about, my book is broken into these chapters, 12 vectors about what makes a viral underclass. I write about him in the one about disability, because people like Ward, and I'm seeing this language come up a lot now, again, as nursing home deaths have been on the rise the past few months, are talked about as if they're disposable just because they're old or because they have other health conditions. And I think about how much he touched my life. He's one of probably the 2 or 3 editors that shaped me the most as a writer, and that I was still in, we were regular conversation. I talked to him about starting my job, and I would talk through stories with him on the phone once I was living in Chicago. And it's such a loss to me. And I think about sort of the other young people who won't get to benefit from that kind of editor, and what a loss that is. And when I wrote out the outline for my book, there were parts of it that were quite open that we intended for me to write about the pandemic, not knowing what would happen. And that was probably the biggest and most personal one we ended up writing about him. But he was a really, really wonderful old school reporter. I still hear him all the time when absurd shit's happening saying, "Can't make that shit up, Thrasher." And he also really embodied, for anyone here who's worked in alt weeklies, the spirit of alt weeklies. And so he's one of the most personal stories in my book that I think sums up why I wrote it.
What I love about both of these stories is the obvious heart and investment and connection that you have to the people that you've written about. And I think that's one of the things that makes both of these books triumphs, because I read a lot of nonfiction and a lot of it is very dry and very boring and has very little to do with emotions, even though these topics are so emotional, because they're literally about life and death in America and the world. So because you are all going to read these books or have already, we are now going to move away a little bit from the books themselves to kind of some of the bigger and broader issues. And one in particular that I've been thinking about a lot that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I imagine a lot of you are in a similar place to me. As COVID and then MPX, monkeypox, has been coming up into the news more and more, I see a lot of comparisons to HIV/AIDS and to the AIDS movement, the activism that came out of it, good, bad, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. In many ways, I feel like because of my own personal life and experience growing up and becoming sexually active before antiretrovirals, have seen these crises through an AIDS lens. And I've seen a lot of other people see it that way too. And some of it seems really useful and fruitful, like we have learned some lessons. But when I look at the disparities in racial transmission, in deaths, in coverage, in care in America over AIDS, COVID, and monkeypox, it seems certain that we have not learned some important lessons, particularly around the ways in which Black communities and Black health have been treated in these pandemics. And I'm wondering if you could, since you are both such experts on sort of all of these crises, if you can tell us a little bit about kind of what can we take and what are kind of the limits of what we learned from AIDS activism as we look at these current pandemics. How can we do better than we did in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s on AIDS activism? What can we learn?
I can start. There's a lot that we can learn, and you're right, there are limits to some of the specifics. I think that my kind of thesis in my book is about understanding why there's a viral underclass that moves across different kind of viruses, and particularly with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2 and HIV, they're extremely different viruses with very different properties, and yet in lots of ways they're affecting similar populations in similarly disparate ways. The particularities of the viruses themselves are important, and I've been on a crash course, like lots of my colleagues as well, learning much more about orthopox viruses and monkeypox this summer, their particularities to them. One thing I think is helpful to understand about why understanding the social determinant of health is important is that LGBTQ people were much more affected by COVID. And that actually, I'll talk about monkeypox and HIV and their sexual components in a moment. There's nothing particularly sexual about COVID. I mean, you can get it from any time you're sharing air. The reasons why LGBTQ people were much more affected are because of all these other economic and social things that happened before. We're much less likely to get good and accurate health care. Lorena Borjas has a story in my book about that. We're much more likely to be poor, to not have wealth, to have jobs with health insurance. And at a very granular level, you could see LGBTQ people are highly overrepresented against our share of the population in retail work. So as face-to-face work comes back, that's one of the reasons why. There's nothing to do kind of with pride or orgies or anything else like that. It's really sort of economics. And then, everyone has benefited from AIDS activism with COVID because most of us, I imagine, in this room are vaccinated, and billions of people have been vaccinated around the world, and the entire process for getting to that was upended by ACT UP. So there's a lot of benefit there. What I found sort of a more direct connection, it has been between monkeypox and AIDS because of the sexual component. And I was actually a little bit surprised when I started seeing reports coming from colleagues in other countries and the outbreaks that were first being seen in Spain and Portugal, the United Kingdom and Canada, before we were seeing monkeypox in the United States, that it was like coming up 95 to 98% men or trans masculine people. And it was pretty obvious to like any of us who study these things, like this is probably moving sexually. There's nothing else. There's no other virus, if you go through the CDC's list or the WHO's list of viruses that are considered sexually transmitted, none of them are like that in any demographic of any kind. And it's not, what do we all share in common? It's sex. It's not watching Drag Race. Like, if it were watching Drag Race, other people would be getting it while you're watching Drag Race. So like it really seemed to be contained in this one area. And there it was like interesting seeing how, for me, the evolution of AIDS activism and gay politics in the 1980s and 1990s that was very closely related to sexual activity and understanding around how to mitigate things sexually, that had very much been decoupled in a lot. And I talk about gay identity. There's a great deal of discomfort of talking about the sexual nature of how this virus was transmitting. The other thing that I think that that queer theory is helpful for, and queerness is helpful for, is that approaching viruses takes science and politics, but it also takes poetry and art and humility. I think humility is one of the things that the United States has had the most difficult time in approaching any of these viruses. And a sense of humility is also needed by scientists, because there's been understanding about monkeypox for 6 or 7 decades, but that virus changed. They had like a significant movement that happened, probably first noted in Nigeria in 2017, where the properties of it were moving differently, such that it seems to have been moving particularly through receptive anal intercourse. And so, yeah, we see a problem with humility right now as well, with trying to get rid of COVID mitigations and various kinds of mitigations. And if you have a sense of humility and a sense of wonder about these things that have such an impact on our life, then that allows scientists and public health people to keep an open mind and sort of see, like, is what's happening what I'm expecting to happen? Because at a certain point, it was not with that monkeypox virus. And had we listened to particularly one scientist in Nigeria in 2017, we would have been much more prepared for what was happening now. So I think that ACT UP and AIDS politics are very helpful for understanding the general nature of what to do, what needs to be done politically. They're very helpful for understanding how the social safety net has not lasted in the United States, if it ever really existed in the first place. But the particular of the viruses are important, and I think that there was a lot of conflict, and it was mostly good conflict, and it's continued with monkeypox. That, for instance, closing the bathhouses for AIDS was not a good idea, because they were places where you could teach people how to use condoms and learn safe sex practices. But it doesn't apply in the same way with a respiratory virus. Like, the act of being together itself is the danger. And then with monkeypox, we just didn't really know exactly how it was moving in those first few months. But I've been extremely proud of groups like what's Adam's party called?
Inferno.
The Inferno sex party here in New York. There's another sex party in Chicago that have really led the way on sort of saying, we're going to pause and then we're going to figure out how to get people vaccines. And they're doing the work to get people educated and vaccinated in the vacuum of what the government was not doing.
Yeah, I believe the Inferno Party actually had a monkeypox vaccine mobile site right outside at their last party.
Really and they've been helping people get connected. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I wrote a piece for The Guardian in the middle of this, who I haven't been writing for much, but they asked me to come back to do this. And talking to people in the UK and the US, and I saw this other places too, but I was interviewing Brits and Americans for this. There was a real sense of sadness and anger at watching the world mobilize for COVID in a very different way than it did for AIDS or monkeypox. Like the real awareness that this, COVID is affecting the quote unquote general population versus these viruses that are affecting sort of subpopulations. And you could see a real difference in government response to these different pandemics.
Mm. I think that, especially with viruses, but with anything, our country has the twin problem of fear and individualism. So as soon as anything happens, it turns into, these people are doing this thing and it's their fault. So with HIV/AIDS, it was really simple. It's like, they're having this sex that, and I know that won't happen to me. And so it's their fault and that's your problem. Then same with, remember early on with COVID, people were talking about the so-called underlying conditions. And it was like, these are people who didn't take care of themselves. Or they're much older. That's why they have heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and obesity. And that turned into, that's not me, and I'm younger, even though they were wrong. And then monkeypox is easy because it's sort of like, this is some kind of sex that I'm not having, or I don't understand, I don't even want to talk about. So I think that kind of both individualism, and it kind of got worse with COVID once the lockdown happened. And then it became this disease where it was disproportionately affecting people of color. So then you saw these anti-lockdown, super right-wing protests. And I remember when I was reporting my story, I definitely wasn't going to them, but I was watching them online. And 100% of the time it'd be like, you can't, it's their problem. We know that the statistics have come out. People of color, especially, Black and Latinx, are more likely to have this, more likely to die. So why do we have to be locked down? And then right away unfurls a Confederate flag. So, that is both that problem of fear and individualism and individual behavior change.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there are so many rich lessons to be learned and to unlearn, I guess, from all of these crises. We'll be spending decades trying to figure all of this out. I'm not checking Grindr. I just have no memory, so I have to look for my questions here, or I will forget what I'm talking about. So continuing along this line about the use and misuse of various histories and of various books, I'm curious. You both have been doing a lot of events, talking to a lot of people, seeing a lot of people talk about your work. What would you say, if there was one misuse, misconception, or outright lie about the work that you have been doing, what is it and how do you push back against it?
For me, most recently, it's been this idea that if talking about, actually, this is not recent. I'll say, for me, the biggest thing is talking about sexual, for lack of a better word, I'll say deviancy, bad thing. And so with more recently with monkeypox, having people say, if you talk about a sexually transmitted infection, they're going to think we're groomers. They're going to think that gay people brought them on themselves. They're not going to have buy into it. I think, having watched this multiple pandemics now, but particularly COVID, and looked at different countries in the world, it's really important to be as honest with people as quickly as possible with the information that you know. And to say, my favorite phrase now is, as I understand things or conditions may change, but this is what we understand now. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it was really important to say, like, if we're seeing something happening in 95 to 98% of men, like, this is telling us something about why this population is 4,500, 5,000% more likely to be affected. And I think that there's nothing shameful about talking about sex. If it's sexually transmitted, there's nothing shameful about that. I want to help people understand how to have sex as safely as they can, how to protect themselves. And also, I'm very concerned about the vacuum that comes up if you don't say it. Because at my university, I've been in a fight with them, which is not new, as Andrew Ross can attest to. But at my new university, they asked a number of us they asked me and a couple other people to talk to the press, and then they sent a communique out to the community later and didn't ask our opinion, just sort of saying it has nothing to do with sexuality, it has nothing to do with any sexual orientation, it's completely about close contact. And that information creates a whole other kind of stigma where people could be afraid to room with gay students or sit next to them or eat next to them in the dining hall. So I think that's there's nothing sort of homophobic to me about naming the sex. But even with Michael Johnson, his case, this young Black man who was a college athlete, did not read or write well, was abandoned by all of his friends and family when he was arrested, was a case that none of the mainstream gay organizations wanted to take, and not the ACLU or the NAACP or any of these groups. And he could have said that he was guilty and taken his sentence. He always maintained his innocence, and he refused to say that he was guilty. But doing so meant he had to open up about all the sex he'd had. And the sex that he'd had was sex. It shouldn't have been criminalized. It was normal in lots of ways. Young people need to understand how to manage risks around it, but it's nothing that should have been criminal. And so when people were sort of telling me, if you talk about monkeypox sexually, it's going to create more criminalization or more stigma. I think if Michael Johnson hadn't talked about his case, if I hadn't written about it, if Mark hadn't commissioned me to write about it, and BuzzFeed hadn't supported it, then he would still be in prison. Eventually, he got out of prison 25 years early. So I think the biggest misnomer for me would be to shy away from talking openly about the truth as we best understand it right now.
I think my two biggest things are when I'm speaking or when groups are reading my book, then especially medical groups, healthcare providers, they think I think they're racist. And so I've been accused a lot of times, do you just think all doctors are racist? And I'm like, no, I never said that. I don't think that, but I do think this is a structural problem. And I think it's people have trouble thinking about structural and institutional issues. That's why the 1619 Project, which I was, one of the people, got in so much grief and so much trouble because it's just hard. People think you're accusing them as individuals of something. And so you're trying, I'm trying to turn myself in knots with like, no, implicit bias. That's what I'm talking about. And even the subhead of my book was race, health, and inequality. And then I'm looking at what I've written and I'm saying, why am I not saying the word racism? And I really didn't want to hurt people's feelings. I didn't want to say people who are, gone through medical school, gone through nursing school, they're midwives, having them think I think they're racist. So I don't think that, but I think at first glance, when I start getting too excited and talking about these issues and, talking about statistics and discrimination and bias in healthcare, which is so well documented, something is definitely going on, that happens. And it makes me feel bad and I've tried to change the way I've talked about it, not because I don't believe it, but because I want to have a real conversation and not just have this wall of defensiveness and anger go up.
There's a lot there that I want to unpack that we'll get into in a moment. I just want to warn everyone, soon we're going to turn to you all for questions. And you have two incredible experts here. So please think about questions, not a time for comments, a time to ask and discuss. So think what you want to talk about in a moment. But before we get there, I'm really glad you brought up institutions and the changing in institutions, because growing up in New York City, outside of New York City, pre-9/11, I thought the world was one thing. 9/11 happened. It took me a long time, decades, to realize that there were certain things that were never going to come back. The lockers that I used in Grand Central to lock up my stuff when I would come into the city for a weekend, they were gone forever. I was never again going to run at a dead run last minute to the airport through the gates and hop on a plane. I think we write these books, at least part of the reason why I write about history, is to understand the present moment better and to make some guesses at what's coming in the future, how our world is changing. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts. We talk a lot about new normal. We hear this phrase, the new normal. Things are going to be back to normal, or they're going to be a different normal. How do you think what you have been writing about and the COVID pandemic, which we are still in, despite what anyone says, is going to change us? How do you think our world is changing in substantive ways? Or perhaps, are we going to go back and this will all just be a blip?
I'm really encouraged by medical students. I've been getting invited to a lot of medical students.
I'm saying to you too, and that's
Yeah.
a completely different domain of learning.
I'm just really excited about it. And some of the times the students themselves invite me, it's not the administration it's the students themselves. And I see that even as they're in medical school or nursing school, which is really hard, they are still trying to make change at their, in their institutions. I'm really excited. There's a woman, I think, I'm forgetting what college she was at. I think it was in Minnesota or Wisconsin. And she was a young Black woman, was sitting in class, and they were talking about this genetic difference in Black and white people. And it was the kidney function. So the kidney function is, it's a mathematical calculation. If you're Black, you get one calculation. If you're white, you get another. And it actually overcorrects for Black people. So in other words, it looks like we're doing better, even though Black people have worse, more often had end-stage renal problems, more often need a transplant, but get left off the transplant list because of this weird calculation. And I recently had a kidney function test, and it was Black-white. The Black was circled for me. And I'm like, what? This is so stupid. This is not a thing. So this woman in medical school was in class learning about this, just wrote, it was in her book. This was like 2 years ago. And she said, why is this? Why is there a Black reading and a white reading? And the instructor said, well, this is how we've done things. And Black people have more muscle mass. And so first of all, she's like, okay, stop. Black people as a group, and she's arguing with the professor, which is quite daring if you're a student. She ended up going all the way through the administrative chain at her medical school, which I'm so sorry, I'm not remembering which school, and ended up getting it changed because it was just business as usual in the book, but there was really no basis. The basis that Black people have more muscle mass as a group was probably left over from enslavement. And if that was the case, then it's definitely good that these things go away. Now I noticed, I just looked it up. I just looked at it on, one of the National Kidney Societies is reviewing the calculation. So who knows, maybe it'll really go away. But I was, really cheered by this one woman who stood up in her class and got this thing changed, even while she was trying to be a doctor.
For me, there are a couple of things that I come back to when I think about what's changed or what won't. And I think the sense of history is really helpful when people say these are unprecedented times. Well, all times are unprecedented. But in terms of, one thing that is unusual is that human history has never had a time where the entire species is sort of dealing with the same thing with the ability to communicate with one another about it. Like, this is a very unique situation that we've been in, and there's a lot of solidarity that can come out of that. And we're seeing, lots of seeds from that being planted, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. So much of the union organizing that's happening right now is in direct relation to unsafe conditions around COVID that have triggered, solidarity. Andrew, who's here, who's part of stuff in Occupy Wall Street, is now, we now see sort of effects that are coming out of that around student loan debt and different things that happen over 10 years or a longer period of time. I think we're going to see lots of good things come out of the ways people have learned to be in community. I look to history to think about AIDS. I tell students this all the time. I tell adults. I talk about it on the radio. Always, there are some people who are shocked when I say, like, your dentist didn't use gloves before AIDS. Like, dentists, orthodontists, doctors, nurses, they were in your mouth with their raw hands.
I remember my dentist had very hairy hands.
Yes.
It grossed me out as a kid.
Now you don't know what's underneath those gloves.
So many, actually, a couple of people have said, like, they remember, like, the hairy knuckles of the dentist going away at some point in the mid-1980s. So, like, things change. We didn't used to understand what germs were or wash our hands. And hopefully we don't always have to wear masks every time we're, together, but there are times that we probably should. And they'll probably be used in lots of medical settings for the future. In Chicago, where I live, I work part of my job downtown on the Chicago campus at an area called Streeterville, and it was completely raised in the late 19th century and lifted up, and the direction of the river was engineered to go in the opposite direction, and they put in sewers and alleys because there have been cholera outbreaks, and they effectively ended cholera with physical infrastructure. Nothing on that level has happened with COVID whatsoever. Like, we're not seeing that kind of effort going into the physical space, even though there's a couple of really good papers out of these hospitals that have been using a extreme but financially doable system of air filtration that seems to get rid of it entirely with enough filtration.
Yeah. Wow.
The good and bad news on that is, I think, yes, Chicago, when I started looking into Chicago, has shown that you could, like, get rid of something in the city through the physical infrastructure. The bad news when I looked into it is it took like 40 years and 3 major cholera outbreaks before finally this physical infrastructure was changed. But there are things that can be done that are not, like, that are totally doable, that I hope change. But the more important thing, I think, is that viruses have, as AIDS did for the queer community in the United States, viruses have reoriented our thinking about our relationships to one another, and I hope that good things continue to come out of that.
Yeah, no, I hope that is true. I will say for myself, I think I may never not wear a mask on the subway again. It's nothing against y'all, but people are gross, and on the subway they're very close to me, and this is reassuring.
Yes.
This next question is actually entirely for me. Y'all are just going to have to put up with it. But I write histories that start at the year where the thing starts and they end in the year where the thing ends. I don't have to do a lot of thinking about how I structure my books, about how to tackle these big issues that have so many different tentacles, where they start, where they end, what is a symptom of the thing and what is the heart of the thing. Both your books take these sprawling topics and they make them both understandable, but also they build them in logical ways where by the end I feel like you have given me like a building. Each brick slots in and I see it come together. And I'm wondering, how did you tackle that as writers? How much planning did you do? How did you come up with these structures? How do you know how to tell these stories?
Complete chaos. Go.
It was some chaos for me too.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, we haven't got to talk about this yet because we both have the shared experience of having magazine stories become part of, and I will admit publicly, I thought the magazine stories, the magazine stories, I'm going to edit them for a week and then that one will be done. No, those were like the hardest to rewrite and re-edit and really kind of break my hold onto what that was into something bigger. But the big thing for me is I started writing about this HIV criminalization case. I had sort of a historical framing around it that involved thinking about the history of.
We'll pause for a moment. No. Take a moment.
That's your ringtone, Jim?
That is quite
So relaxing.
It's lovely, yeah.
It's very relaxing. It's okay.
Nope. We'll just get a little serenade, a little night music,
I like your husky shirt.
It does look like it's looking right at me, though, like
It
staring
does,
me in the
'cause they have
eyes.
the blue eyes are a little. God,
This is an elaborate ringtone.
what an elaborate system!
This is my fault for not announcing that we should have turned off phones. I take full responsibility.
Look, now it's starting again.
I think I can talk now.
Yeah.
Can you? Okay.
No, I can't.
Do we have a tech person in the audience who might be able to give some assistance here? Is there?
Maybe it's an alarm.
Oh.
I don't remember.
You were saying the magazine pieces were the hardest to sort of break.
With the Michael Johnson story, I knew that I wanted to frame a history.
This is good because this event needed a little levity. We have been talking about a lot of very deep subjects right now. This is the moment for everybody to get it out, communally have a laugh.
Okay.
Fabulous.
So I knew that I wanted to frame this history, looking at kind of the history of race in the United States and understanding the history of slavery, and to a certain degree, because his screen name was Tiger Mandingo, I was kind of linguistically looking at the relationship to the Mandingo people, but that was a very brief part of what I was doing. And I was starting to think of that this book might be by itself, or I might write a book about HIV criminalization. I was thinking about writing about some things in my own family when COVID hit. And so I stopped what I was trying to do with my book at that time and didn't know if I'd be able to write a book or if I'd be able to sell a book. But it was my agent who said, let me look at your dissertation again, which had been, and you were on my committee. It was called Infectious Blackness, and it was very much about understanding this case in relation to systemic racism. And then she looked at the dissertation. She said, oh, the last chapter is called The Viral Underclass. And she said, you should really use that as an analytic to think about what's happening in the pandemic. So I stepped back and I tried to think about how I could write about HIV and AIDS and other pathogens, but primarily that one, and understand how health disparities were created and use this idea of our underclass as a lens to look at what was coming with COVID. So I knew that I wanted to have a kind of 40-year history from the beginning of our understanding of AIDS till now. I wanted to have like a 1 to 2 year history of COVID. And in those various vectors, I do look at different, it's going to be your turn now, different histories and ways that it ties into other places in the world.
Wow. All right.
I was just going to expand my Black mothers and babies story. And I wrote a proposal that was really good. It was really good because I sometimes for side cash write other people's book proposals. So I'm really good at proposal.
Really?
Yeah.
No,
Oh, that's good to know.
yeah. I should have hired
I'm gonna
you.
write
Yes.
that down.
So proposals, I'm great at, like just a meaty outline. So my book was an auction. There were like a big drama around, who's going to get my book. Okay, so then I get the deal with Doubleday, and then I'm like, oh, I can't write this. This is just a proposal. Now I have to fill in the blanks. And what I realized is that my first chapter is called Everything I Thought Was Wrong. Because when I went through, I realized, wait, I was the person who was, as a young editor at Essence, telling everybody, hey, if you just know better, you do better. If you just take care of yourself, you'll raise your own health, and everyone will raise the health of the race. And then I'm like, that's not right. I don't even believe that anymore, but that's where I was. And then I kept going through my own through line, and I was like, oh, this is how I learned about all these things. And then in the middle of the book, when I was just supposed to be near the end, COVID happened. And
I didn't know you were that far in.
yeah, I was, this book
That's
is
right, yeah,
a year and a half late. So I started reporting on COVID, and I said, this confirms everything I know now. So then I had this nice through line, and I could just sort of plug in the different, I did some fresh reporting, but also plug in sort of these stories into this timeline that was more about my own learning.
One of the things I'm really drawn to in what both of you said there is you said, this is how I learned. I think so much of writing ends up being like writing and then realizing what I'm actually writing about, or someone else says to you that right there, like you were saying, pointing out the viral underclass as an analytic. I often think that I write in part to learn what it is that I actually think, because when I put it down, I go, oh, wait, that's not right. Like you said, I don't even think that anymore, And so I think that's one of the great things about writing. I'm going to end, my last question is on a quote. So I have to pull it out from your afterword. As you wrote, we would not be the first to say it out loud. Others had called out racism in healthcare. Still, it seemed aggressive, even hostile, to stake that claim in a room of mainly white healthcare providers and public health professionals. It felt as if we were accusing these generally well-meaning people of being racist. So this is what you were talking about just a moment ago. And I think it can be easy on racism or on any other issue that we feel called to speak out about, whether it's getting someone to wear a mask or getting someone to change their behavior or to think more deeply about what it is they are doing and how they move through the world. I think that it can be easy to imagine that folks like you or me who are experts in some of this have an easy time doing these things, but it's actually not easy ever. I think that there is no way to be a passive anti-racist. You have to take action because, as you were saying, it's institutional, right? You go along with the flow and you are going to go along with these things. So what advice do you have to everyone in the room here tonight? How do we get better at speaking up? Or how do you, let's personalize it, how do you step into that and say, wait, actually, I'm not wrong, and I don't want to hurt someone's feelings, but I also need to say what I need to say. Do you have advice for how we carry this conversation forward with us?
You.
I think I think people should say what they feel and mean and deal with the consequences.
I am more like it was interesting because one chapter of my book takes place in West Virginia.
Yes.
And I went there because I'm like, anybody that gets treated badly becomes ill, no matter what it is. If you're LGBTQ, if you're disabled, older, and in this case, white, and being treated badly in a state where, the reason I was attracted to it was because there was an HIV outbreak that you read about. And why is there an HIV outbreak in 2020 in West Virginia, which is like maybe the second whitest state? 94% of the population's white. So I went there and I saw people treated so badly. And I thought, racism is people treated badly for this reason, for the reason, of history and skin color. But anybody that's treated badly gets ill. And when I thought of, I write about weathering, which is the effect of the body, what happens to your body when you're treated badly and you have to cope with it day in, day out, and it changes the system of your body. And when I was in West Virginia, I kept thinking, wow, everybody looks older than I'd look at somebody, I go, okay, I think that person's 70. It'd be like, oh, I just turned 50. And I just thought, well, if you have a terrible industry as coal mining, then that goes away, and then you are, feeling like shit. So then opioids are flooded into your community. You take them, you get addicted. The pharmaceutical companies get in trouble. They go away. Then you get addicted to heroin, and all these things happen, and you're made to feel like it's your fault, without any glance at the institutions. And the governor is like some really rich guy who owned some coal industry thing.
Justice, isn't that his
Yeah,
ironic last name?
Yeah, I think it is. It's terrible. And I just thought, look, these people are being treated badly. This isn't a black thing. That's what I thought. This isn't a black thing. It's just that we've been dealing with it longer and worse than everybody else. But if I just think about it like that, and I just think it feels terrible when anyone is treated badly. And that's how I kind of think about it. I also try to, I was the only black person basically at my high school. And I just went back to my high school reunion. And, at first I was like, I'm in a purple area, I guess would be the most generous way to say, it's mostly red. And I went back with this book, saying, racism. And I was surprised at how people, when I talked about it with them, and I took it slow, I didn't make assumptions. It was really sweet and generous. I felt very moved by, my high school friends coming to my reading. And it was really nice.
And so I would add to that, both our books intersect with West Virginia. I wrote the story because you referred me to the story. And I didn't get to go to West Virginia when I was planning to for my reporting trip because they had an uptick of COVID, and they were also dealing with opioids and also flu.
And HIV.
And for me, the real change for my dissertation to the book was also understanding my lens coming through this was race, and it's a very important one, but it's only one of the vectors through which people are made to feel unwelcome and unwell. And I think that when you were asking Hugh about why do we talk out or how do we talk out, so many people are siloed in silos of shame, of ways of being made to feel bad about themselves for being poor or trans or Black or having any kind, or obese, or being made to feel like the things that are happening to them are their fault. One of the people I write about is this Greek activist who was HIV positive and also killed by a mob that included police in Greece, in a completely different country. And one of his quotes that really haunts me is he says he thought that homophobia was a personal problem. He thought it was like his own personal failing before he knew other queer people. And so I think it's really important to talk about the difficult things that we go through, because we can build a lot of solidarity around them. And that actually does help, I think, something as you're talking about, sort of take down some of the defensiveness about racism. When we understand racism is one way people are getting fucked, but they're also getting screwed through disability, ageism, fat phobia, all these different ways. And we don't have to, the systems make us feel it's our fault, but we don't have to accept that it's our fault. And there are ways that we can make the world better.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a perfect moment to end this part of the talk on this idea of community, right? That coming together is a critical part to answering any of these problems, because it's only together we can see what is a communal thing that we are all going through, what is a system we are being oppressed by versus what is just my personal experience. And so since we are all in this room together tonight, I want to take a few minutes. I know it's already after 8 o'clock, but do folks have some questions? Got a hand right here.
I appreciate what you've done this evening with that particular iceberg. I taught high school in Harlem for 30 years in very progressive school and very successful. The thing is, I have an biracial granddaughter too, and I discovered that I have to change the way I see the world in order to be able to talk about it. Because their world is very different than mine if I had a white granddaughter. It's a very different experience. Like, for example, healthcare. Her mother, for example, doesn't believe in breastfeeding. It's part of the family tradition. It's a whole good thing. I have a different feeling about that, but that doesn't mean we can't have a conversation. And I think I was thinking plenty in the way I was talking about race, class, and gender. Race, class, and gender, and how that operates all the time in our society. And what is the language that goes beyond race, class, and gender? What you've done is really important, and this is a huge, huge discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim.
Listen, I apologize to everyone, it's a pixel and I don't fucking know how to use it. Thank you both for your, I'm halfway through both of you, okay? But I know both of your work. And what I've been dealing with in my own life is trying to understand the pathology of oppression. What is the participation of the individual in not standing up to the institution? And as an activist, it's been something that's concerned me, but trying to be also human about it, to understand people's journey, to stopping being just a victim, if that's the word. I don't know if that's the correct word. But it's like when PrEP was introduced. I remember being at that conference, and it was like cheerleaders came out on the stage, and I felt like I was at a rally for life, you know. But there was an old lesbian that got up at one of the last community meetings here. And she said, if you guys don't change your behavior and take responsibility, we're not going to come and rescue you again. And turned around and walked out of the room. And I thought that with PrEP, there was a moment when maybe we should look at what the pathology of oppression has done to us as individuals and the kind of culture that we create. And so, Stephen, you're sort of wonderfully non-judgmental. Let's just talk about it more. Let's just talk about it more. Let's just normalize it. Remember Michael Callan and Larry Kramer being on an early television show about AIDS. And Larry has now changed his position sort of when he's talking to straight people. And he's not yelling. Michael says, I've had over 10,000 people in me. Larry plots because he was so afraid that straight men found out about the amount of sex without any cost.
They'd be very jealous.
They may be very jealous, and also be very other things. So the pathology of oppression and how racism deals with that. I think, Linda, in your book, at one point you said that when people become most aware of what racism has done, it bothers them. You know, they age, I think you say age quickly. So, and that was a very provocative statement to me. And I'm still thinking about it. But what do you do, or what do you suggest people do when they've read your books about health? I could say, let's get everyone to do, single payer, or, meditate all. But this kind of, how do we detox ourselves from the culture that we've grown up in? And, many voices have talked about this, and made this even that's the question I have for you. What is the result? What would you like the result of your books to do to the reader and to the culture?
So for those of you who can't hear in the back, the question was, what would they like the books to do to people and the culture? And also, how do we detox ourselves from some of this?
When I first started to talk about my book, when it was newly published, I went to New Orleans where my daughter lives. So she was like, okay, let's practice your talk. I'm like, I'm giving this thing like a million times, but young folk. So I'm talking to her about it, and she was like, well, what audience are you trying to reach? And I said, I really want to make a difference in the healthcare system itself and, really change that, because people and she said, no. She said, one of the things that your book does is really lifts up people's stories. There's a lot of people that think they're so-called crazy because they've had such bad experiences. They think it's their fault. And what you're saying is, no, this is a problem that is much bigger than individuals. My daughter said that, and I thought, oh, I'm so focused on, I'm going to change the healthcare system so that people don't have a bad time, or, I'm going to get rid of racism all to itself, and not acknowledging that there's a lot of people who are in pain because something terrible happened to them, and they were blamed for it. And she said, you need to remember that there are those people, and they will be in your audiences, and they will want a kind of, sort of, whatever kind of hug from me and from the book. And I really took her words to heart when I saw my own New York Times book review. It was great. Okay. It was great. It was such a good review. And then right in the middle of it, the woman who was writing the review talked about her own horrific experience giving birth, and that she had almost a near disaster giving birth, and that she felt ashamed and was made to feel guilty about what happened to her, even though her baby survived, but she spent 5 horrific days. And I just thought, this is so widespread. And in some, I'm big on evidence. In some ways, people's individual stories become evidence. They are evidence. And I've got to acknowledge more than comes naturally to me sometimes, that this book is about lifting people's experience and saying, you are not alone.
I'm trying to be open to people taking what from it they need to. I also want people to feel seen. I feel there are 1 million people mourning, or there are 1 million people have died in the US, so there are tens of millions of people mourning them. I wanted to give space for that. I wanted to give particularly journalism students and journalism practitioners, and I think your book does this as well. I don't know if this was your goal, but I think it does it beautifully. A way to understand that very rigorous critical journalism can be very personal, and that doesn't make it any less so. That that really shows what the stakes are. I do think that there's like this tension, as you were bringing up, between sort of modifying behavior or sort of saying things are only systemic. And a lot of us, like I didn't have sex for the summer, and this was not unusual. A lot of gay men did it this summer. We like flatten the curve, and I try to talk about it's something I can do. There's some people who cannot do that, and I would try to say as non-judgmentally as possible, if you can limit the number of your partners, that will help and help you. But I hope people who read my book can think about those things in a way that's not judgmental. We'll have conversations about them to understand, yes, if you're a gay man, you are 5,000% more likely to get monkeypox. That is a systemic reality. Are there ways we can mitigate that through abstinence or sexting or sex pods, or are there various ways that can be mitigated, and can we do so without shame? So that's part of it. And I do think that there needs to be the end of capitalism and the end of and healthcare for all. I think that's a very important part of it. But I wanted to give readers the chance to be able to think about some of those things politically, but also on the personal level. And I've been surprised. I don't know if you've had surprising responses from readers. I've been surprised to get letters from readers who had COVID themselves and said, I felt like I was left for dead, and I appreciate you recognizing the way that I was just left for dead by the system. Mm-hmm. I thought of that happening, people connecting with it, having lost people. I thought less about people who'd gone through it themselves, reacting to it.
I wanted to add, I teach Black studies sometimes. I teach medicine, Black studies, and journalism at City College. And so I was teaching a Black studies class, and I showed 13. Ava DuVernay's wonderful documentary about mass incarceration. And it's so good. So I have these students, and they're mostly either first gen, working class, many come from the Bronx or the surrounding community. So I turn on the lights, and I'm just so excited to talk about 13th, wonderful movie. And then I see everyone's face is negative. And I was like, wait, you didn't like the movie? No, it glorifies crime. It makes excuses for crime. And these are young folk and all people of color.
Huh.
And so I took a pause, and I thought, don't do it. Don't give a screaming, hysterical lecture. Do not take them back to 1619, and don't do it. And what I did was took a breath and realized that systemic and institutional racism, people that are part of it don't understand it. So you were calling it kind of like a pathology, but it was really, to me, it was like, oh, you didn't know. Wait, I've got to take this class in a different direction, slow down, teach. These are the things, because people were saying, well, I got out of my community. The people left there are just making a mess of the hood and all this stuff. I was like, oh my God, you sound crazy. And then I'm like, no, this is your reality. What can I share with you through the real history? You're from the New York City public school system. You didn't get this. This is why the 1619 Project existed in the first place. And it was fun. I slowed down, took them back through, and it was an interesting lesson for me to just meet people where they are.
And I love what you called out about that. I was saying it's fun to actually meet someone where they are and talk to them in a real conversation, not having to harangue someone, not, like that is that kind of meeting of people together, I think is how we learn best, or how I learn best. There's a lot of hands. So I saw somewhere, then the person in the back with a fabulous leopard print mask, and then we've got a couple more hands, and then we might run out of time. Oh, he's not leopard?
No, it's a little glasses.
Oh gosh, I have bad vision. I need new glasses.
I thought it was
All right,
leopard
start
too.
over here. Oh wait, we start here and then we'll go to you. Sorry. Yep.
Halfway question from the AV booth. So Stephen, you I feel like could segue with monkeypox, and then you mentioned that you aren't shy to this idea of let's talk about it. If these things are happening through a specific type of sexual intercourse, let's not shy away from it. And it brought me to what felt like such a silly experience getting my monkeypox vaccine of you roll up to weird little warehouse pop-up in Bushwick where they slide you a piece of paper that nobody explicitly wants to say the demographic of people showing up for the vaccine this early. So it was sliding this piece of paper that's are you gay? Are you poor? Are you a trans? And then this contract nurse worker who is so these are the requirements, would you still like to get the vaccine today? And then so never in this interaction is anything explicitly discussed of why I'm here to get this. But everyone knows it. And so I guess for either of you, what has your response been having this informed background, these other viruses and watching those play out, and specifically with AIDS, and how our response is shifting, but maybe still isn't progressive enough that how would you navigate those things of wanting to be able to talk about those things explicitly, but also still not wanting the narrative to get not wanting the stigma to perpetuate itself, but then also making sure that the people who need to be prioritized are still prioritized, but not this weird much sort of, I don't know.
Well, I think so. Explicit reason why I talk about, and so I'm not running away, just my legs were getting stiff. An explicit reason why I wanted to talk about actions, because the action, you should always follow how viruses are moving. So HIV, I think, should be thought of as sexually transmitted infection because it moves sexually. It also moves to injection drug use. When you're in environments with injection drug use, you're trying to find out who is using them and how to get care to them. With monkeypox, I'm very interested in, I should not say that, sir, but I'm very interested in anal intercourse. I'm very interested in anal intercourse with monkeypox because that could actually be, so I have a colleague who's investigating, are the women who are becoming infected with it coming through anal intercourse? Is that how it's happening? And that's where we see, an action is not necessarily an identity. People have anal intercourse of all gender expressions and all sexualities. I'm not saying that's definitely how it is, but there's reason to explore that. And if you just say male or female or gay or straight and don't actually try to find the pathway, you might actually be allowing a way that people are becoming infected. You don't always ask that just at the moment of, the beginning of a pandemic or a vaccine campaign, or at the moment of the window. I got mine outside a bathhouse. But it's helpful to be looking at that. And I was very concerned in the beginning of the pandemic, beginning of the monkeypox epidemic, although it's in 100 countries, so it should be called a pandemic, that we've just come out of COVID. People have a particular frame of reference of how that virus moves. And so I'm sure most of us remember how there are these videos circulating, oh my God, someone's on the subway with me, they could be giving monkeypox. And that's where it's calm down, that's not how it's happening. When we have so little of it, we want to make sure it's going to the people who are going to be the most affected. And it's not perfect exactly how that was said, but it was pretty good, and it's worked out pretty well over the summer. But yeah, that's sometimes I'll just try to be what can we talk about at a very almost literal level? Is it moving through? Nobody was studying the first month that I could find. Is it moving through injection drug use? Is that something we have to look at? It doesn't seem to be, but it needs to be looked at, and that's why I think sometimes it's very granular. Say, put identity aside. What's the action that's happening? Who's using that action? Send the vaccine there.
I'm good.
Okay.
All right.
Didn't mean to tower over you. Sorry.
Okay.
So my questions mostly for Stephen, but also so I haven't read your book yet, Stephen, but I'm going to. So I apologize if you're right about this.
No apology needed.
I was curious about your thoughts about the outbreak of breakthrough COVID cases in Provincetown in July of 2021, I guess. But it's actually in Provincetown.
Were you there?
No, but I did get COVID in Provincetown recently. I wilded out.
Yeah, I was actually in Provincetown working for a local newspaper at the time, so it was kind of interesting to see it from there, and it was like kind of surreal to see it make national news. But I was curious what your thoughts were about some of the early reporting that was done, and some of the like I thought not such good reporting that was done about the outbreak, and kind of like playing up the sort of like party dignity path after it, and also what your thoughts were about some of the better reporting that's come out of why there's actually a pretty good community reaction for to it, and also sort of like thinking about that demographic and what advantages that demographic of predominantly white and wealthy people or men mostly in Provincetown, like sort of what advantages that demographic had in combating that outbreak.
I didn't see much reporting. I don't remember much reporting about it. I did read the CDC paper about it, which was very well written. The whole campaign was very well controlled, but I thought it was odd. Like they don't say anything about gay men or MSM or anything in the paper, which I thought was odd. And they're sort of like a county and, outside of Boston in Massachusetts, or it's in Massachusetts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're sort of like using it these euphemisms, which I thought was a little silly. But otherwise it was well written. The report and the campaign worked out well. I can't speak as much to the local reporting. I will say I was very, very happy and very surprised that the first 2-3 months of monkeypox reporting was extremely good and very well written. The volume of it wasn't where it needed to be, but the people doing the writing were doing an extremely good job. And that feels like a shift over things were learned in COVID that made that reporting better, I think, from a journalism perspective.
Okay, so I see one more question, and then maybe we'll wrap up after this.
Okay, we've been reading in various media outlets about how it's okay, even if we don't have enough vaccine, if you get a fifth of it intradermally, you'll be fine. Can any of you talk to how truly effective that is or is not?
I don't think we can because there's not good data. So it is a problem. The campaign started on a study, of this process for people who aren't familiar, of stretching each monkeypox vaccine into fifths and giving it in a different way that's more like the way that you get other kinds of, like the way you get an injection rather than getting just a vaccine. There's not a lot of data on it yet. The rates are coming down. It seems to be working. It does not work. So I scar very badly. I have a history of keloid scarring. And so I got it the same. And I'm hearing anecdotally from people, some people are getting asked that and some people are not. And you don't want it if you are, not just for cosmetic reasons, but also because it won't work if you have this history of keloid scarring, or if you don't know that you're keloid scarred and you get it that way. So it is, it would be better not to do it, but in the general, there's a general framework. The UK did this, a bunch of countries did this. The UK was the biggest one to do it with COVID. There are arguments for, in general, giving less vaccine to more people that works better for protecting the collective body. In general, with COVID vaccines, giving many more first shots than 2 shots to half the people works better, and this seems to be working in that way. But there's not, there wasn't a lot of data. I was not comfortable with going out with that plan after one study.
Did you get how many COVID boosters have you had?
I've had 3. So I've had the bivalent booster.
Has everyone else had that one?
I have not.
Yeah, you had it? I haven't yet because I had COVID pretty recently. Yeah. Yeah. You?
Not yet. No,
Yeah.
I have to. Yeah.
But will you get?
Yes.
Me too.
Just haven't yet. Well, this has been an incredible conversation. I want to thank the both of you. I want to thank the Bureau for hosting this. This is an incredible space and resource to our community. If you're going to buy the book tonight, not later, you should buy it here. I also want to take a moment to just call out the incredible artwork around us and behind us, Satanic Panic by Catalina Schliebner-Munoz. The work is incredible. If you've not seen it before, take a moment while you're waiting to buy the book to check out the art. And thank you to everyone for coming out tonight in the midst of a number of overlapping pandemics on a Friday night when you could be doing a lot of other things, including
You could
napping.
be upstairs at that party.
Or at a party. So thank you everyone for being here tonight.
You know what? The artwork over there looks a little like my book jacket.
It does actually. Oh my
You're right.
The colors and the swaths.
Oh.
Yeah. It's gorgeous.
All right. I have to sign my.
Yeah.